Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Student Association for Fire Ecology Connections Hereafter Safe webinar series. My name is Badri Gimiri, and I'm a PhD student at Texas Tech University, where I study plant-fire interactions. I also serve on the National Safe Leadership Team and help plan this webinar series. I will be your moderator for today's session. The goal of this webinar series is to create a space where students and early career fire ecologists can learn from and engage with a diverse group of professionals. Before introducing today's speaker, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on SAFE website soon. During the presentation, please keep your microphone muted. Following the presentation, we will have time for Q&A. You are welcome to submit questions in the chat throughout the talk, or you may unmute yourself and ask your question at the end. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Victoria Donovan. Dr. Donovan is an assistant professor of forest management at the University of Florida's West Florida Research and Education Center. Her research focuses on understanding how ecosystem processes, particularly fire, influence ecological persistence and recovery across multiple spatial and temporal scales. I first came across her work about 3 years ago while I was reading her paper on increasing large wildfires in the eastern United States, and I've been eager to learn more about her research ever since. With that, I'm very excited to hand this floor over to Dr. Donovan. Dr. Donovan, you can start your talk. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. All right, I will share my screen here. Can you see that okay?
Looked great.
Perfect. All right. All right, well, thank you so much for joining today, and thank you again for the invitation. As was said, my name is Victoria Donovan. I'm an assistant professor of forest management at the School of Forest, Fisheries, and Geomatics Sciences at the University of Florida, and I'm based out of the West Florida Research and Education Center. Today, I'm going to be talking about a culmination of work that myself and a number of lab mates, students, colleagues have been conducting on changing wildfire regime dynamics in the eastern United States. Specifically, I want to talk about patterns, drivers, and talk a little bit about potential opportunities as well. Let's see. All right, before I begin, I just want to acknowledge the co-authors associated with the work I'm presenting, Drs. Ray Crandall, Jen Phil, and Chris Wonka, as well as my graduate students or recently graduated graduate students, Noah Weidig, Alan Ivory, and Michaela Ivy, and of course, the many different funders that have supported our research. So headlines like this one have been filling our news feeds for decades now. We've heard about these large destructive wildfires burning across Western forests. And when we think about these large destructive wildfires, that tends to be what we think, that these occur primarily out west. But we're increasingly starting to see that change. So headlines like this one from the 2016 Great Smoky Mountains wildfires in Tennessee are starting to become more common in the East. These fires in particular killed multiple people, and they were associated with millions of dollars of damages. And we're seeing these more and more. So in 2024, we had numerous wildfires burning in the Northeast, where we saw wildfires burning in every borough of New York City. We had wildfires burning in the Carolinas following a major hurricane there that was catching news attention. So I'm sure a lot of you now are starting to recognize or see these wildfire events in the East. And if we just look at some general trends, we can see that these patterns are starting to shift. So this is a paper by Iglesias et al. In 2022. In this map here, we're just looking at the number of wildfires or the locations of wildfires across the continuous US between 1984 and 1999. So all the yellow dots are wildfires, and then the orange and the red are just really big fires. And so what you can see from this pattern here is that most of our fires are occurring in the Western United States, and we have far fewer occurring in the Great Plains and the Eastern US. But when we look at the next chunk of their assessment from 2005 until 2018, you can see we have a lot more wildfires burning out west, but also a lot more in the Great Plains. And we're also seeing more in the eastern US as well. They looked at some basic dynamics of these wildfires and how they were changing. So in these plots down here, our first one on the left is looking at annual area burned on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, we're comparing differences between these two time periods for the western US at the top, Great Plains in the middle, and then the east on the bottom. You can see we have some substantial changes in the western US, also some pretty big changes in the Great Plains in terms of area burn. We're also seeing these shifts in the east as well. And that's the same for the number of fires per year, which is this middle plot. Again, some really substantial changes in the Great Plains, for instance, but we're also seeing those shifts in the east. So today I want to talk about what's going on with wildfire in the eastern US. I'm going to start by talking about where we've been, so a very extremely brief history of fire in the eastern United States. Then I want to talk about where we are now. That's going to be the bulk of the presentation, where I'm talking a lot about our research program and what we've done to look into this. And then finally, I want to talk about where we can go, what our next steps are potentially to reduce wildfire risk. So in the map I have on the screen here, we're looking at mean fire return interval occurring across the continuous US prior to Euro-American settlement. And the different colors are representing different fire return intervals. So the darker the orange color, the more frequent the fire return interval. And then the cooler the color, all the way up to purple, the longer the fire return interval. And so what you can see is that the eastern US, and particularly the southeast, had some of the most frequent fire return intervals in the country prior to Euro-American settlement. These fires were started by lightning, but they were also stewarded by Native Americans that burned across these areas. And they generated complex structures and diversity in the ecosystems here. So a lot of our ecosystems are adapted to these really frequent fire return intervals. For example, longleaf pine is a really great example of that, where we have this highly fire-dependent ecosystem that dominated a lot of the southeast. And it's clear if we look across ecosystems globally that fire has played a really important role in shaping the dominance of open ecosystems like savannas and grasslands. So if we go all the way back in time to where open ecosystems, savannas and grasslands, began to spread across the earth millions of years ago, we actually see that it coincides with a major spike in fire occurrence. So in the plot that I have here, we're looking at relative charcoal flux of ocean sediment, which is just basically telling us fire occurrence a really, really long time ago. And what you can see is we have this huge spike in fire occurrence that coincides with this major spread of grassland and savanna systems around 7 million years ago. And it's now very well established within the scientific literature that the existence of many of our open ecosystems are highly dependent on frequent fire. When we think about this, we generally talk about a feedback with fire. And a good example of this is the grass fire cycle. So fire prevents dense trees and shrubs from establishing. This increases fine fuel loads associated with grassy understories or a full grassland. And then this promotes more frequent fire because grasses are highly pyrogenic. And then this continues to prevent dense shrub and tree establishment. Obviously, this cycle varies for ecosystems. For instance, in longleaf pine systems, we have this interaction between our grasses and the understory, as well as the needle cast from longleaf pine that's promoting this frequent fire. But in general, we have these important feedbacks that help to maintain the open ecosystem structure. So it makes sense that in the eastern US, we had some of the most frequently burned ecosystems because a lot of our systems prior to Euro-American settlement were open forest and savanna systems like oak savannas and pine savannas. Now, when Europeans settled in the United States, they displaced Native Americans from their land. And this meant that Native American fire stewardship was almost completely lost. And then we also saw this shift towards fire suppression activities as well. So when we did have wildfires ignite, we went for an immediate effort to suppress those fires. And so we had this rapid shift in fire culture where previously we saw the promotion of fire and we shift to an eradication or elimination of fire. And this led to regions like the Great Plains and the eastern US, particularly the southeast, to be considered kind of more low risk for wildfire when we today. When we think about wildfires, again, we're often thinking about wildfire risk associated with the Western United States, even though our most frequent fire systems are the Great Plains and the Southeast. All right, so just a quick recap on that history. Where have we been? Open ecosystems like those in the East are highly dependent on fire. And the Southeast in particular is one of the most frequently burned regions in the United States. Fire exclusion has eradicated fire from most of the Eastern United States, but we're starting to see, as I mentioned, those dynamics change. Okay, so let's talk about where we are now. We already know that we're starting to see signals of changing wildfire dynamics within the Eastern US. So when I moved to Florida, I moved to the Eastern US and started research here. One of the first things I wanted to do was identify changing wildfire regime characteristics across different regions of the Eastern US. So to do this, I collected large wildfire perimeter information from MTVS, the Monitoring Trends in Burn Severity database, between 1984 and 2020. That gave us 2,433 large wildfires. These are fires greater than 200 hectares in size, which is the size threshold for MTVS records in the Eastern US. And then we summarize these patterns across 35 different level 3 ecoregions, which are in the maps you can see here. So the first thing we wanted to do is just summarize large wildfire regime characteristics across these regions. So here we're just tallying, for instance, the number of large wildfires that occurred across these different ecoregions over our study period. The darker the orange color, the greater the number of fires. And so what you can see is that the southern coastal plain, which makes up the vast majority of Florida, as well as the central Appalachians ecoregion, have by far the most large wildfires occurring among these different ecoregions. In terms of wildfire size, we see some different patterns. So this is average large wildfire size. You can see that we've got large wildfires occurring again in that southern coastal plain. We also have the middle Atlantic coastal plain along the East Coast, and then you can see some larger wildfire sizes in Arkansas and Texas as well. And then we look at patterns in total area burned. You can see that total area burned is largely reflective of wildfire number over wildfire size. And this makes sense because unlike the Western US, the East is prone to smaller fires. And so it makes sense that wildfire number is much more prevalent in determining total area burned over wildfire size. Okay, now how are these wildfires changing? To understand this dynamic, we used Mann-Kendall's tau, or a modified Mann-Kendall's tau, to indicate the strength and directionality of trends through time in large wildfires. And so the darker the red color, the stronger the increasing trend, the darker the blue color, the stronger the decreasing trend. And then the gray areas represent locations where there just wasn't enough data to conduct a statistical assessment. So what you can see is a lot of ecoregions, the vast majority of ecoregions we assessed, and primarily in the Southeast, we're experiencing increases in wildfire number through time. When we look at average wildfire size, we see some differences. For instance, in the southeastern plains, which is experiencing a strong increase in the number of large wildfires, is seeing a decrease in average wildfire size. Generally, our biggest increases in average wildfire size are occurring in the Ridge and Valley ecoregion that runs straight through the eastern US from Alabama to Virginia. And then we also have these ecoregions in Arkansas experiencing increases in both wildfire number and average wildfire size. And then total hectares burned is kind of looking, changes in total hectares burned is kind of reflecting the patterns in both of these two. We also track changes in large wildfire seasonality. So this is just when large wildfires are occurring throughout the year. In this map, we're looking at a Bray-Curtis dissimilarity index. So we compared seasonality of fires in the first decade of our assessment compared to the last decade of our assessment. And you can see that a lot of these ecoregions are gray. That's just because we did not have a lot of wildfires in the first decade of our assessment in most ecoregions, since we're seeing these increases. And so there wasn't enough data for us to actually compare seasonality. But in the ecoregions we were able to assess, we saw some substantial shifts in seasonality. Here are some density distributions where just the date, the Julian date, I've just put down the months here on the x-axis, is plotted out on the x-axis, and then we're comparing the density distribution of fires between the first decade of assessment, so 84, sorry, to 1993, and then the last decade of our assessment, which is 2011 to 2020. And so the last decade's in gray, the most recent decade of our assessment is in red. And so you can see that we saw some substantial shifts in seasonality. I'll focus you in specifically on some of these ecoregions in the southeastern corner of our study region. What you can see is that we had a lot of our large wildfires become more concentrated within the late winter and early spring, and fewer wildfires occurring within the fall. All right, when we're tracking changes in large wildfire, the other thing that we really want to consider is the wildland-urban interface, or the WUI. This is where wildland vegetation and urban development intermingle. And it's also the place where we see the greatest risk to human life and settlement from wildfire. The reason why we really care about the WUI in the eastern US is because it's far more expansive in the east compared to other regions of the country. So in this map here, the red and the yellow areas represent WUI. And you can see just how concentrated the wildland-urban interface is in the eastern US relative to all other regions. And so we really want to understand how this change in wildfire regime dynamics might be impacting the wildland-urban interface. My graduate student, Noah Weide, wanted to look into this for his master's research. In this map, he's just looking at the WUI, the percentage of land area covered by WUI in 2020. And so you can see that a lot of our WUI is concentrated within the northeast and more the southeast, whereas the western portion of our study area had less WUI. But when we looked at the relative change in WUI through time, you can see that some of the greatest increases are occurring in that western chunk, so kind of bordering the Great Plains, as well as in the southeast. Some quick facts that NOAA calculated for this research. 45% of all large wildfires in the eastern US were WUI wildfires. So almost half of the large wildfires burning in the east are interacting with the WUI directly. WUI wildfires also accounted for 55% of the area burned. So these wildfires interacting with WUI make up the majority of area burned in the eastern US. And on average, these WUI wildfires are 46% larger than non-WUI wildfires. So when wildfires are interacting with the WUI, they tend to be bigger. We also see a lot of variability in the number of or the proportion of large wildfires that actually intersect with the WUI based on their location. So here we're looking at ecoregions on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, we're just looking at the proportion of wildfires that fell within the WUI. I know the labels on the y-axis are a little bit small, but I'm going to highlight two that I want to point out to you here. If you recall looking at wildfire number, the Central Appalachians, which is the top bar that I've highlighted there, and then the Southern Coastal Plain, which is that middle bar I've highlighted, have the greatest number of large wildfires occurring over our study period. But you see there's a huge difference in the amount of these fires that are actually interacting with the WUI. So in the Central Appalachians, we have over 75% of large wildfires burning within the WUI, whereas in the Southern Coastal Plain, we have about 30% of those wildfires interacting with the WUI. Most recently, we've started looking at relationships between ignition location and then damage to structures, as well as injuries and fatalities to people. What we found is that 68% of WUI wildfires are ignited outside of the WUI and then spread into the WUI, which makes sense in terms of why we're seeing these larger fires as well. They're probably fires that are experiencing strong enough wind conditions or fuel connectivity that they're able to spread from those exterior ignitions into the WUI. These exterior ignitions also result in substantially more structural damage and injuries. And these exterior ignitions, though, result in less WUI burned per wildfire. So even though they're causing a lot of damage, they're generally burning less of the WUI than wildfires that were ignited within the WUI. And so this, again, kind of speaks to the potential for these more extreme conditions pushing these wildfires into the WUI. In the graph here, we're just looking at total structures in the top graph on the y-axis and total people on the y-axis of the bottom graph, and then we're just looking at exterior versus interior ignitions, and those are relative to the buoy. So you can just see that substantial difference in the number of damaged and destroyed structures and injuries and fatalities. NOAA wanted to understand whether the increases in wildfire that we were seeing across the eastern US were associated with buoy wildfires or whether they were associated with wildfires occurring outside of the buoy. So what he did was repeat the assessment that we conducted across the eastern US, but he conducted it by looking at only buoy wildfires and then looking only at non-buoy wildfires. So in this figure here, we've got the same color scheme as we did in our original study, where a darker red color indicates a stronger increasing trend and a darker blue color indicates a stronger decreasing trend. And what he found is that we did see some slight increases in the number of buoy wildfires. There are only a few ecoregions that experienced significant increases in buoy wildfires, and those are largely concentrated in that southwest corner. Whereas we saw a lot more significant increases in non-buoy wildfire number. So a lot of the increases that we're recording in the east are happening outside of the buoy. When we look at average wildfire size, though, we do see that buoy wildfires tend to be getting larger compared to non-buoy wildfires. He also wanted to compare just the amount of the buoy that are burned by wildfires compared to what we would just expect if we had a random distribution. So in these plots, we've got the eastern temperate forest in that top left-hand corner, and then we've got our 3 level 2 ecoregions this time as our other 3 plots. And we've got the true distribution of wildfires in terms of the percentage buoy area that they're burning as the red density distribution. And then we just have random buffered points to the size of wildfires as the blue distribution. What we found is that wildfires are actually burning a lower proportion of the buoy than we would expect at random, which suggests that suppression, mitigation, and resources are somewhat effective in the region. But he also found that wildfires are burning disproportionately closer to the buoy than we would expect at random. So what that suggests is the increases in wildfire number that we're seeing outside of the buoy could still be largely impacting the buoy because it seems like these fires are burning closer to the buoy than we would expect. And so we still have a lot of potential for suppression resource strain and smoke impacts as well. Okay, so the next question that we want to ask whenever we see these changing regime dynamics is why? Why is this happening? What can we do about it, right? So when we're thinking about wildfire regimes, there are 3 main things that we think about in terms of driving their characteristics. The first is ignition patterns. We also think about patterns in fuel and vegetation, and then we think about weather and climate dynamics as well. So I'm going to go through each of these briefly and talk about some of the findings that we have and other researchers have found as well. In terms of ignitions, we know that in the US, 88% of wildfires are started by human ignitions. So the vast majority of our wildfires are started by people. And we see that consistent in the eastern US. Here we're just looking at the eastern temperate forest. You can see we have far more human-caused fires than we do lightning ignitions. Most of our lightning ignitions are centered on the summer. You can see that our human-caused fires, where we see, that greatest shift in seasonality, where we're having more wildfires occurring in the spring, those are primarily human-caused. We looked into whether we saw significant changes in the proportion of wildfires that were caused by human versus natural ignitions to see if maybe there was something there where there were more human ignitions causing wildfires in recent years. What you can see is that there are changes in the log odds for the proportion of human versus natural wildfires across a lot of ecoregions. However, none of these changes were statistically significant. And so that suggests to us that ignitions are generally not a limiting factor for large wildfires that might be driving some of the patterns that we're seeing in this region. That said, I think it's really important to, when we're thinking about managing wildfires, to recognize that most of these large and destructive wildfires are being caused by people. So in this graph, we're looking at the percentage of WUI wildfire ignitions that were associated with these different slew of causes listed on the x-axis. And we're just comparing that between exterior and interior ignitions. What you can see is that arson is by far the biggest cause of WUI wildfires, regardless of ignition location. You can see debris and open burning is a major cause of interior WUI ignitions as well. So this data kind of gives us some information on how we might work to try to limit the amount of destructive large WUI wildfires by trying to prevent human ignitions. Okay, the next thing that I want to talk about is fuels. And I'm really interested in this because even though wildfires are increasing in the US and globally, even though they're increasing in the US and in a number of different places globally, the US and the globe in general is actually in a fire deficit. That means there's far less fire today than there was historically. And what we know is because fire plays a really important role in creating these feedbacks for open ecosystems, when we remove fire, we're substantially altering the fuel or vegetation dynamics, and that can make fires more difficult to suppress. So recall we have these feedbacks that are preventing, for instance, dense shrubs and trees from forming within these ecosystems. And when we remove them, we see substantial shifts in forest structure and fuel accumulation. So these are just some pictures of famous tall timbers plots. We're looking at tall timber Stoddard plots. We're looking at an unburned forest that's remained unburned for multiple decades on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, we're looking at a forest that's experienced a 2-year fire return interval for a long time. And you can see that that frequently burned forest has this open savanna structure, grassy understory, whereas our unburned forest is extremely dense, a huge amount of biomass, a lot of ladder fuels that can allow fire to move from the ground into the canopy and support canopy fire. So very different structural dynamics. And I'd like to show this image, even though it's from the Great Plains, because I think it's a really good example of how different fuel types can promote very different fire behaviors. So this is a picture from a prescribed fire that was burning in a site that had some encroachment from eastern red cedar. So this fire is occurring under the exact same conditions. These fuels are burning right beside each other, but you can see the grasses on the left have much smaller flame lengths and thus much lower intensity compared to the eastern red cedar tree that's burning on the right-hand side. So my graduate student, Michaela Ivey, wanted to look into changes in woody cover, first of all, through time. Is woody cover still increasing in the eastern US, or have we basically, saturated it with woody cover because of this century of fire suppression? And what she found is that woody cover is significantly increasing across every ecoregion in the eastern United States. So the darker the green color in this map, the greater the increase in woody cover per year. My lab as a whole wanted to look at what was causing these increases in woody cover. Is it due to forest infilling, or is it due to land use conversion, areas being converted to forests? And so in this map here, we're looking at the difference or a ratio of infilling versus conversion. So if the ecoregion is more brown, it means most of the increasing woody cover is associated with forest infilling. And if the ecoregion is more blue, it means most of the woody cover is associated with land use conversion. So you can see that the Northeast is experiencing a lot more forest infilling, whereas the Southeast is experiencing a lot more land use conversion. Just to understand those patterns in land use conversion, we can look at a chord diagram here. I know it's a little bit confusing when you first look at it, but I'll give you an example. If you look at the deciduous forest, which is kind of that medium green in the corner, in the top right corner, you can see that the vast majority of deciduous forest at the start of our study period stayed deciduous forest at the end of our study period. So that big arrow kind of going back onto deciduous forest, that's what it's showing. What we see is that we have a lot of shrub, scrub, and grasslands being converted to evergreen forest. And this is likely associated with pine silvicultural expansion, which is occurring across a lot of the southeast. We also saw encroachment of these systems, and we also saw a lot of encroachment in wetlands as well. So, is higher levels of woody cover actually associated with increasing large wildfire risk? Michaela calculated this across different ecoregions, and she found that there was significant increase in the odds of a large wildfire occurring when we had higher levels of woody cover. So in this map, again, the darker red means a higher odds ratio. So these higher levels of woody cover are increasing wildfire risk. NOAA did some modeling related to this across multiple scales in the eastern US. He looked at a number of variables, but I want to focus just specifically on woody cover because it goes with my flow of my presentation here. And basically what he found is that there was a significant increase in the probability of a wildfire burning within the WUI as we had increasing woody cover. So again, that increase in woody cover is not only increasing the probability of wildfire, but it's also increasing the probability of WUI wildfire. And if you're coming from out west, you might think, well, of course, woody cover is going to increase wildfire risk. But in the eastern US, this is a little bit counterintuitive in some respects because the eastern US experiences a process called mesophication, which is a positive feedback where we have fire excluded forests experiencing an increase in mesophytic species that promote cool, moist, humid conditions. And so they decrease the flammability of forests. They make it much harder for fire to penetrate into those forests. And so a lot of people associate this with dampening fire and a fire deficit. But what we're seeing is that we're having these dense forests that may or may not have experienced mesophication, to be clear, having higher risk of large wildfire. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more when I start talking about climate. And then my graduate student, Alan Ivory, has been looking at another major shift in fuel dynamics in the eastern US, which is invasive species. And he's specifically looking at Kogan grass, which is an invasive species occurring across the southeast. And it's been associated with changes in fire behavior. And so here in this plot, you're just looking at surface rate of spread for non-invaded sites, the cluster on the left, versus invaded sites invaded with Kogan grass, the cluster on the right. And then we're just comparing the impacts of Kogan grass on surface rate of spread relative to different seasons. What you can see is that Kogan grass impacts rate of spread for every season. Most substantially, you can see that change in the spring. And so we have these invasive species like Kogan grass that can substantially increase fire behavior and make them more challenging to suppress, spreading across the east as well, which could also be playing a role in shifting regime dynamics in terms of fuel. Okay, so we talked about ignitions, we talked about fuels. The next thing we need to talk about is weather and climate. We know that climate change is playing a huge role in shifting wildfire activity in the western US and more broadly globally. We know it's going to be playing a big role in the east as well. Over the course of our study period, there were trends of increasing temperatures, for instance, annual temperature across our study period. We know there's also increasing variability in drought. And so Michaela wanted to look at the interactions between drought and woody cover. And she started off by just looking at patterns in drought. So here we're looking at the density of wildfires relative to PDSI, or the Palmer Drought Severity Index, accumulating over a 9-month period. So this is an indicator of long-term drought conditions. In the top left-hand corner, we have the eastern temperate forests, and then we have a subset, a selection of ecoregions from other locations in the eastern US that had sufficient data for our analysis. And basically what you can see is we have this bimodal distribution. It occurs across different ecoregions. It's obviously really clear at the level 1 eastern temperate forest scale, where we have a lot of our large wildfires occurring under mild to moderate drought conditions, which makes sense. If we have drier fuels, it's more likely to burn. But then we also have this jump in large wildfires occurring under these slightly to moderately wet conditions as well, which is not something that we would expect. So to look into this further, we looked into short-term drought conditions as well. So for this, Michaela used 14-day SPEI, Standardized Precipitation Evapotranspiration Index, accumulating over a 14-day period, so a much shorter time span. These plots look a little confusing, so I'll walk you through them. On the y-axis, we have 14-day spay. A negative value indicates drier conditions. A positive value indicates wetter conditions. And then on the x-axis, we have days till and since fire, where the 0 line indicates the time that a fire occurred. And she's added this gray bar here as well to kind of highlight that. So if you look at the blue line in the middle, that's kind of our median conditions, our kind of normal conditions. And then the gray line above that is indicating the patterns in 14-day spay that are occurring for wildfires that occur under those moist conditions. What you can see is that we have these rapid drying events that are occurring right before wildfires. And we're associating these with potential flash drought events, where we have rapid drying that can promote these fires even under long-term moist conditions. Okay. And then finally, Michaela wanted to look at the interactions between these weather variables, or look for potential interactions in these weather variables and their relationship to woody cover. And she found that long-term drought, PDSI, we have predictable relationships, drier conditions, higher probability of wildfire, higher wind speeds, higher probability of wildfire, greater vapor pressure deficit, higher probability of wildfire, all those things we would expect. She also found this significant interaction between 14-day spay and woody cover. So basically what she found is that we have a high probability of large wildfires burning within or occurring when they're burning within higher levels of woody cover and occurring under these rapid drying events, these short-term drought events. So if you have extremely dry conditions over the short term and high levels of woody cover, you have a high probability of large wildfire occurrence. And this helps explain some of this potential interactions between wildfire and mesophication, where we have this high accumulation of fuels within these potentially mesophyte forests, and we might experience rapid drying, which can overcome a threshold associated with those moisture dynamics that mesophication creates, allowing for a large wildfire to move through. Something that we want to look into in more detail. A lot more work has to be done on it. It's an interesting dynamic to think about. So where are we now? To sum up, wildfires are increasing across the southeastern US. A number of these fires are occurring within the WUI. And increasing fuel loads and changing drought are likely both contributing to increasing large wildfire risk. There are a number of other factors we need to consider as well. For instance, we have expanding WUI, changing social dynamics associated with fire and management, all of which need to be considered in future research. All right, so where can we go? We know that trying to remove fire from fire-frequent ecosystems has been a failed experiment. We tried it in the United States, we removed fire, we experienced substantial ecological degradation of our fire-dependent ecosystems, and we're still seeing this increasing wildfire dynamic. But we also know that we're predicted to see increasingly fire-conducive conditions in the future. We're supposed to see rising temperatures, more variability in precipitation, an increase in these drought events that are going to be potentially exacerbating wildfire activity. We also have these increasing trends in woody cover across all of our ecoregions, which if we don't start to manage forests, particularly for that infilling, we might see continued increasing wildfire risk. And then we have the spread of invasive species that's continuing to happen, which could also potentially exacerbate fire intensity. So what do we do? One of the first things that I always recommend, or I'm going to recommend, is we fight fire with fire by embracing prescribed fire as a tool to help us reduce wildfire risk. So we know that these systems are fire-frequent systems. We can reintroduce fire into these systems, reintroduce that grass fire cycle, if you will, to reduce the probability of high-intensity fire. If we reduce some of these fuel loads, we might still experience fires, but inevitably they'll hopefully be lower intensity because of the reduction in fuel loads. And at the same time, we're also helping to restore our fire-dependent ecosystems and the ecosystem services they provide. There are a lot of fears about prescribed fire, but it's clear from research that prescribed fires are far safer than waiting for a wildfire to occur. So this is actually research that I conducted in the Great Plains. We're looking at maximum spot fire distance here. So that is basically when we have a lofted ember from a fire that's burning. It goes up into the air, and then it's carried by the wind to a new location where it's able to ignite a new fire. We call these spot fires. And these lofted embers are a major issue for fire containment and for destruction associated with wildfires. So we have spot fires that are able to start outside of containment or control lines when we're trying to manage a wildfire. It starts a new fire in a new location, which makes them challenging to suppress. Also, these spot fires, these lofted embers landing on roofs, are the leading cause of structural damage within fire as well. So we really care about them. Okay. So in this plot that we're looking at here on the y-axis, we have maximum spot fire distance potential. And then we're looking at 3 different fuel types. So this was simulated in the Great Plains, but we're looking at grasslands, encroached grasslands, and then dense woodlands. And we're looking at how maximum spot fire distance changes among those fuel types, but then also when we look at fires that are burning only under prescribed fire conditions compared to fires that can burn under larger wildfire conditions. And what you can see is that obviously our spot fire distance increases as we allow fuel accumulation. So if we allow these dense woodlands to be created in the Great Plains, at least, we see this increase in spot fire distance. But if we let those dense forests burn under wildfire conditions, we see substantially greater increases in that maximum spot fire distance, much higher risk. We also know that prescribed fires are much more safe to implement than wildfires. Here we're just looking at the total number of fatality or fatal injuries from wildfires versus prescribed fires in the US. And you can see that obviously wildfires are much more dangerous for firefighting personnel. So we can help to continue to promote fire in the Eastern US by educating people on the value of prescribed fire to support public awareness and acceptance. We have a lot of acceptance of fire in the Southeast generally, whereas in the Northeast, there's a lot more hesitation around prescribed fire. But we also know that a lot of land in the Southeast is privately owned, and we can see more hesitancy with private landowners compared to public land managers as well. And then because of this, we also need to provide resources and support for the application of prescribed fire by landowners and agency. Particularly these private landowners need assistance, and things like PBAs, prescribed burn associations, can help private landowners get fire on the ground. We can also see some of these wildfires as opportunities as well, potentially. So we have these large wildfires moving through. They're likely thinning a lot of these dense fuels that might make it challenging for us to apply prescribed fire in the first place. And so we can use these wildfires as jumping off points to start potentially managing some of these systems for lower fuel loads, as well as building off these wildfire perimeters to get more fire on the ground and reduce these fuel loads in some of these areas. That said, even though we apply prescribed fire, that's not going to mitigate for climate change. We're going to continue to see increasingly conducive wildfire conditions. While prescribed fire might be able to reduce the intensity and severity of these fires, it's not going to prevent all wildfires. And under extreme weather conditions, we're still going to see these high intensity fires. So it's important to recognize that wildfire is inevitable, and we need to prepare for it the same way we prepare for any other natural hazard. In Florida, people know to prepare for hurricanes. We need to prepare for wildfires as well. So to do that, we can create defensible space around homes and buildings by reducing flammable vegetation. This decreases the probability that we're going to have lofted embers landing on our roof and that flames are going to come in direct contact with our home. We can also create fire-resistant homes and buildings. We can retrofit our houses. For instance, tiles, your shingles made of petroleum-based products are much more likely to ignite than a metal roof. And so you can retrofit your house to make it more fire-resistant. And then finally, you need to have a plan for what happens if a wildfire does come. Know where you should go to evacuate, or what resources you should look at to figure out how you should evacuate. Some people have go bags for hurricanes. Maybe you have a go bag for a wildfire as well. If you're interested in learning more about how to prepare for wildfires, you can check out Firewise USA. It has a number of resources related to this. With that, just to sum up quickly, what's going on with wildfire in the eastern US? In terms of where we've been, we know that the eastern US historically had very frequent fire return intervals, some of the most frequent of the country, particularly in the southeastern US. However, following Euro-American settlement, we saw this shift in fire culture that almost completely eradicated fire from the east. We now see wildfires are increasing, likely due to a combination of changing climate dynamics and changing fuel loads, at least based on our research, but there's still a lot more work that needs to be done on this. And finally, where we can go, we can continue to promote prescribed fire and other forms of fuels management, but we also need to be prepared for wildfire. We need to realize that fire is a natural part of these systems and that it is inevitable. We need to learn to coexist with that. With that, I will say thank you so much, and I am happy to answer any questions that you might have.